The slap echoed across the ballroom with the force of a thunderclap. Crystal chandeliers trembled overhead, their delicate frames swaying like trees caught in a sudden wind. The sound reverberated through the cavernous space, silencing every conversation, freezing every movement, stopping every breath. It was the kind of sound that people would remember for the rest of their lives. The moment when everything changed, when the world shifted on its axis, when power itself was redefined. The entire room, filled with the most dangerous people in Asia, stood in absolute stunned silence. Because the woman who had just struck the most feared Mafia king in Seoul across the face wasn't a business rival or a political opponent. She wasn't even someone these people recognized. She wasn't a rival syndicate leader seeking to challenge his authority through force. She wasn't a corrupt politician attempting to reassert control. She wasn't a businessman trying to reclaim leverage in the empire's complex financial structures. She was a maid, a quiet maid in a simple black uniform, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, her posture humble and unremarkable. Someone who had spent the last 3 months scrubbing floors in this mansion, cleaning bathrooms, serving drinks at private parties, arranging flowers in vases, pressing clothes in the laundry room. Someone no one had ever really looked at. Someone who had been invisible to every single person in this ballroom. Until she wasn't. The mark of her hand was already beginning to redden on Kang Taemin's cheek. His expression cycled through shock, fury, and then something more dangerous. Calculation. The man was intelligent enough to understand that this moment would define his reign, would determine whether he maintained absolute control or whether power itself was being challenged in a way that transcended simple violence. Kang Taemin. The name alone was whispered with fear across Asia. He was the undisputed king of the Korean underworld, the man who controlled crime syndicates stretching from Tokyo to Bangkok to Singapore. Politicians made special appointments with him. Billionaires sought his approval before making major business decisions. Generals in the military consulted with him on matters of national security. Armies of bodyguards protected his every movement. He was the kind of man who had ordered deaths with a casual flick of his wrist. Deaths that were carried out within hours by operatives who knew better than to question his authority. And a maid had just slapped him. The security personnel surrounding the stage began to move, hands reaching toward weapons, bodies tensing with lethal intent. But Taemin raised his hand sharply, and they froze as if their nervous systems had been suddenly disconnected from their brains. His eyes never left Victoria's face. He stared at her with an intensity that seemed to pierce through every pretense, every careful construction she had created. For 30 seconds, though it felt like an eternity compressed into a single moment, nothing happened. The tension in the ballroom became almost unbearable, pressing down on everyone like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe. Somewhere in the background, someone's phone fell and shattered against the marble floor. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the suffocating silence, like a gunshot fired in a cathedral. Then, in a movement that would be replayed on every news channel around the world, analyzed by political scientists and criminal psychologists, discussed in intelligence briefings from Washington to Beijing to Moscow, Kang Taemin slowly lowered himself onto one knee. The gasp that erupted from the assembled crowd of crime lords, politicians, and billionaires was the sound of a world shifting on its axis, the sound of established order collapsing, the sound of everything these people had believed about power being fundamentally challenged. One of the most powerful men in Asia, on his knees, in front of a maid, in front of a woman they had all looked through without seeing, dismissed as insignificant, treated as part of the mansion's fixtures rather than as a human being. "I swear allegiance to the true owner of this empire," Taemin said, his voice steady despite everything. "I pledge my service to Victoria Ashford." And in that moment, everyone in the ballroom understood. The maid they had ignored, the servant they had looked through without seeing, the invisible woman who had moved among them like a ghost, had just claimed an empire worth billions of dollars. An empire built over 3 decades. An empire that controlled drug shipments across the Pacific. An empire that corrupted politicians from Seoul to Tokyo. An empire that wielded power in the shadows of legitimate government. The girl who had been invisible had just become the most important person in the room. The most powerful woman in Asia. 3 months before that incident, The rain fell over Seoul in thick sheets, as if the city itself was weeping for what was about to come. Victoria Ashford sat in the back seat of a black luxury car as it approached the iron gates of the Kong estate. Her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression calm and blank. To anyone observing her, she would have seemed like exactly what she appeared to be. A nervous young woman on her first day of work, excited but trying not to show it, excited about finally getting a job at one of Seoul's most prestigious estates. Nothing could have been further from the truth. For 3 years, Victoria had been planning this moment. 3 years of research, investigation, and meticulous preparation. 3 years of learning languages, studying martial arts, training her body and sharpening her mind to a razor's edge. 3 years of living like a ghost, moving from country to country, staying in cheap hotels, taking low-profile jobs as a housekeeper or cleaner or gardener, never staying anywhere long enough to be remembered, never forming connections that could be used against her. All of it had led to this single moment. Stepping out of a car and walking through the gates of the mansion of the man who had ordered her father's death. The man who had orchestrated an assassination that had sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. The man who had seized control of an empire that wasn't his to take. The security guard at the gate barely glanced at her as she approached. He was large, professional, alert, the kind of man who had been trained to notice threats, trained to see through disguises, trained to identify danger. But he didn't see Victoria as a threat. He saw exactly what she wanted him to see. A young Vietnamese woman in a simple maid's uniform, nervous and unremarkable, the kind of servant that gets hired and forgotten within a week, the kind of person whose face blurs in memory, the kind of worker who is completely and utterly forgettable. "First time in Korea?" he asked casually, his eyes already drifting back to the security monitors where multiple screens displayed different angles of the estate. "Yes, sir," Victoria replied softly, keeping her voice pitched low and deferential, using the accent she had been practicing for weeks in a small apartment in Bangkok. "I'm excited to work at such a prestigious estate. I hope to do my very best." The guard smiled slightly, clearly not interested in conversation. He handed her ID back and pressed a button. The gates swung open with a heavy mechanical sound that seemed to echo with finality. "You're lucky," he said dismissively. "Most people would kill to work here. But between you and me, the boss goes through staff like most people go through tissues. Don't take it personally if you don't last long. It's nothing to do with your work. He's just paranoid about security, always worried someone is trying to get close to him, always thinking there are threats around every corner." Victoria forced a smile that never reached her eyes, a smile that was practiced and empty and perfectly convincing. "I understand, sir. I'll do my best." As the car pulled through the gates and up the long driveway toward the mansion, Victoria took her first close look at her target's home. The Kong estate was enormous. 5 stories of reinforced steel and bulletproof glass, surrounded by a manicured garden that probably cost more to maintain annually than most people earned in 5 years. Security cameras were mounted at regular intervals along every wall, their lenses pointed at every possible angle of approach. She could count at least 20 that were visible from the driveway, which meant there were probably double that hidden in positions she couldn't see. Guard towers stood at each corner of the property, manned by alert personnel armed with weapons. The entire perimeter was enclosed by a fence topped with what appeared to be razor wire and sophisticated electronic alarm systems. It was quite literally a fortress designed to keep people out and, if necessary, keep people in. A fortress designed by someone who understood that the higher you climbed in the criminal underworld, the more enemies you made. A fortress built by a man who understood that power always created threats. Victoria had studied the security schematics for weeks, had obtained blueprint copies through sources she had cultivated in South Korea, had mapped out every camera position, every guard rotation, every possible vulnerability in the system. She knew the blind spots. She knew the guard rotations. She knew the locations of every camera and every hidden alarm. She had memorized the floor plans of every room in the mansion, from the servants' quarters to Kang Tae-min's private office to the underground bunker that existed beneath the main house. She understood the weaknesses in the system, though she also understood that trying to breach the security through force would be suicide. No amount of preparation could overcome 30 armed personnel and sophisticated security systems. That's why she hadn't planned to breach it. She had planned to walk through the front door. The car pulled around to the servants' entrance, a side entrance that had been designed with the specific intention of processing household staff without allowing them to see the main areas of the property. A woman with severe features and graying hair was waiting. Her name was Miss Park, the estate manager, a woman who had been running the household for 10 years and took immense pride in her ability to maintain order among the servants. She looked Victoria up and down with the expression of someone evaluating a piece of furniture, assessing whether it would fit properly into the space intended for it. "You are Amelia Chin?" she asked, her tone suggesting that any deviation from the expected answer would result in immediate rejection. "Yes, ma'am," Victoria replied. Using the Vietnamese-inflected English accent she had been practicing for weeks in multiple different settings, practicing in front of mirrors, practicing while watching videos to ensure her pronunciation was exactly right. "You have references?" "Yes, ma'am." Victoria handed over a file. The references were all forged, impeccably forged, created by a document specialist she had hired in Bangkok for a significant sum of money. They were untraceable, each one leading to businesses that had been carefully constructed to exist just long enough to verify her employment history before dissolving back into the digital void, leaving no trail for investigators to follow. Miss Park looked through the file briefly, scanning the pages with practiced efficiency, seeming satisfied by what she saw. She handed it back without making copies, which Victoria understood was a testament to how thoroughly her documents had been prepared. "You'll start tomorrow at 6 in the morning. You'll work in the main house, cleaning and light-serving duties. You report directly to me. You do not speak to Mr. Kong unless spoken to, not under any circumstances. You do not enter his private office or bedroom without explicit permission. You do not discuss anything you see or hear in this house with anyone outside these walls. Failure to follow these rules will result in immediate termination and, if necessary, legal action." Victoria nodded, understanding the seriousness of these instructions. "Yes, ma'am. I understand completely. I will follow all rules exactly." "Good." Miss Park gestured to another woman, who appeared to be in her 50s and had the worn, tired expression of someone who had been performing hard physical labor for decades. "This is He-Jean. She'll show you to the servants' quarters and get you settled." As Victoria followed He-Jean through the back corridors of the mansion, she was already observing, analyzing, committing every detail to memory with the precision that had been instilled in her since childhood. The layout of the hallways and how they connected to other parts of the house. The locations of security cameras and which angles they covered. The positions of the servant stations and what supplies were stored in each one. The sound of the security systems as they activated and deactivated when doors were opened, providing her with information about which doors had individual sensors. The distance from various rooms to stairwells and exits. By the time she reached the small room that would be her home for the next 3 months, a cramped space barely larger than a closet, with a single bed and a small dresser, she had already mentally mapped out the entire route from her quarters to Kong Taemin's private office on the 3rd floor. She had already begun her work. Victoria had learned to hate in London. She had been 22 years old, in her 3rd year at Oxford University, when her world collapsed into chaos and darkness. Her father, Edward Ashford, was not the kind of man who appeared in society columns or attended charity galas or philanthropic events designed to benefit worthy causes. He was not known to the general public, was not mentioned in newspaper articles, was not featured in magazine profiles. But within certain circles, circles of extraordinary wealth and power and darkness, his name was whispered with respect and something approaching fear. Edward Ashford was the financial architect of the largest criminal empire in Asia. While other crime bosses built their power on violence and threats, on guns and intimidation, on the credible threat of sudden death delivered without warning or mercy, Edward Ashford had built his empire on something far more powerful: money. And not just money in the crude sense of cash and gold and diamonds. He had constructed an intricate web of shell corporations, offshore accounts in countries with lenient banking laws, legitimate businesses that provided cover for illegal operations, and complex financial instruments that allowed billions of dollars to flow through the criminal underworld while leaving almost no trace for law enforcement to follow. Without Edward Ashford's genius, the empire couldn't function. Shipments couldn't be paid for. Politicians couldn't be bribed with the sums necessary to ensure their cooperation. Operations couldn't be funded. International money transfers couldn't be arranged. Every major syndicate in Asia depended on his ability to keep the machinery running, to ensure that money flowed smoothly from operations to operators to infrastructure to expansion. Victoria's mother had died when she was 8 years old. Cancer. A slow, painful decline that had taken months. Victoria still remembered her mother's smile, the way she would sing while cooking breakfast, the soft sound of her voice reading bedtime stories. Her father had grieved privately but never let that grief interfere with his duties as a parent. He had raised Victoria alone, in the English countryside, in a house surrounded by rolling hills and pastoral beauty, giving her the best education money could buy. Knowledge is power, he would tell her during their evening conversations in the library, surrounded by books. Not the crude power of violence, but the true power of understanding. If you understand how things work, how money moves, how people think, how systems function, you can accomplish anything. You can reshape the world according to your vision. He had taught her to ride horses across the green fields near their home, to speak 5 languages fluently: English, Mandarin, Spanish, French, and Arabic, to understand financial markets and read legal contracts and understand the tax codes of different countries, to see the hidden patterns in seemingly random data, to think several moves ahead, like a chess player contemplating the board. He had shown her a world of extraordinary complexity and beauty, a world where money was like blood flowing through the veins of civilization, where the right information could move billions of dollars across the globe in seconds, where understanding the system was worth more than any amount of physical force. Victoria had loved her father, and she had believed, in her naive way, in the way that only a child can believe, that he would always be there, that he would always be safe, protected by his intelligence and his position, that they would continue these conversations, these lessons, indefinitely. She had been catastrophically wrong. The call had come at 3 a.m. on a Thursday morning. An unknown number. A woman's voice, urgent and afraid, speaking quickly as if she had only seconds to deliver the message. Victoria, your father is dead. Leave the country immediately. They're looking for you. Go. Now. The line had gone dead. Victoria had sat in darkness for hours, unable to move, unable to process the words. Her father dead. The man who had raised her, taught her, shaped her into the person she was becoming, gone. Erased. No longer existing in the world. And someone wanted her dead too. She had later learned the details through newspaper accounts and careful investigation. A meeting in Hong Kong. A coup orchestrated by rivals within the criminal empire. Her father had been betrayed by people he trusted, killed by a man named Kong Taemin, a rising young syndicate leader who had decided that control of the empire was worth more than loyalty, worth more than honor, worth more than the life of the genius who had built it. The official story was that it was a routine killing in the underworld, power struggle, violence that was part of the normal functioning of that dark world. Tragic, but inevitable. But Victoria knew better. She had found her father's encrypted files, hidden on a laptop she had discovered in the safe he kept at their London home. A safe she had known about since she was 10 years old, and he had taught her the combination, explaining that she might someday need access to it. The files contained everything. Names of politicians on various syndicates' payrolls, dates of major transactions, details of operations, long-term strategic plans. Names and faces of the people who had ordered her father's death. And among those files was a letter addressed to her, written in her father's familiar handwriting, written the night before he died. My dearest Victoria, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. I've tried to protect you from the knowledge of what I am, what I do, the nature of the world I operate in. But I suspect that may no longer be possible. I want you to know that everything I've done to build something for you. Not just wealth. Any fool with ambition can accumulate money. Plenty of criminals, plenty of violent men, have accumulated vast fortunes through force. But fortunes built on violence are fragile. always subject to challenge by younger, hungrier, more ruthless competitors. I've tried to build a structure, a system, a foundation that will endure. Something based on intelligence rather than guns. Something that creates its own momentum through the elegance of its design. I don't know if I'll survive the next few months. My instincts tell me that danger is approaching. The empire is becoming too valuable, and I've made myself too essential. Eventually, someone will decide that my death is worth more than my life. Someone will decide that they can run the empire without me, even if that's not true. If that happens, I want you to know this. The empire still belongs to you. The true financial control, the real power, is held in a series of encrypted accounts and documents that only you can access. The passwords and locations are hidden in the blue book on my shelf, the one with the gold spine. The world will think the empire belongs to whoever kills me, but the world will be wrong. Use this knowledge wisely, my daughter. Not for revenge. Revenge is a poison that destroys the person who drinks it more thoroughly than it destroys its intended target. Use it to build something better. Something that honors what I tried to create. I love you. Father. Victoria had cried when she read that letter. She had cried for hours, alone in the darkness of her dormitory. Cried with a force that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her soul. But when the tears finally stopped, something had hardened inside her. Something had crystallized. Something had transformed grief into purpose. She had gone to the safe. She had found the blue book with the gold spine. She had discovered the passwords. And she had learned the truth about her inheritance. Her father had been right. The empire still belonged to her legally, financially, completely. Kong Taemin had taken control of the operations, had positioned himself as the ruler, had claimed dominion over the criminal enterprises that spread across Asia. But he didn't control the money. He didn't control the encrypted accounts. He didn't control the true foundation of power. Victoria Ashford was, on paper and in fact, the owner of a criminal empire worth tens of billions of dollars. The problem was no one knew that. And if she told them, if she revealed her identity and her claim, she would be dead within weeks. Kong Taemin would order her assassination immediately. The other crime families would seek to eliminate her before she could claim what was hers. She would be hunted by forces she couldn't possibly stand against. So instead of fighting, instead of trying to claim what was hers through legal channels or direct confrontation, Victoria had disappeared. She had taken her father's advice and learned how to be invisible. She had spent 3 years becoming someone entirely different. Someone small and quiet and forgettable. Someone who could slip into any situation without being noticed. Someone who could work in the mansion of her father's killer for 3 months without being discovered. Someone who could then reveal the truth in a way that would shake the criminal underworld to its foundations. Victoria's first week at the Kong estate was the most terrifying week of her life. She had studied the security systems extensively, had obtained detailed blueprints through black market sources, had researched the guard rotations through careful surveillance. She understood the camera placements and the blind spots. She had prepared herself mentally for the dangers of living in a fortress, had run through scenarios of discovery in her head hundreds of times. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have fully prepared her for the reality of it. The estate was a place of casual, everyday danger. In the servants' quarters, the other maids gossiped about which staffers had been fired or had simply disappeared. In the hallways, she occasionally glimpsed the kind of violence that happened in the underworld. A man with fresh bruises covering half his face, blood on someone's shirt where it had been hastily wiped clean, the casual mention of removing a problem, as if discussing the disposal of garbage. Victoria learned to move through the mansion in a way that made her almost invisible. She didn't just clean. She became the cleaning. She moved so silently that guards would sometimes jump when they realized she was nearby. She didn't speak unless spoken to, and when she did, she kept her voice small and deferential, pitched low so that it seemed like background noise rather than actual communication. She made herself the kind of person that people looked through rather than at, the kind of person that faded into the background of everyone's consciousness. It was exhausting in a way that physical labor could never be. The muscles could rest at night, but the mind had to remain constantly alert, constantly performing, constantly monitoring the reactions of every person she encountered. But it was necessary. Every day she was getting closer to her goal. Every day she was learning more about Kang Taemin's routines, his patterns, his security protocols, his psychological vulnerabilities and paranoia. Every day she was positioning herself to strike. 2 months into her employment, Victoria made a discovery that changed everything. She had been assigned to clean Taemin's private office. A rare privilege that only happened once a month, always with a security guard present to ensure she didn't steal anything or plant surveillance devices. But on this particular day, the guard had gotten a phone call, clearly important, and had stepped out into the hallway for a few minutes. Victoria had precisely 4 minutes. She worked quickly and efficiently, noting everything with the precision that her father had taught her. The art on the walls. Expensive pieces, probably purchased through underground auction houses. The books on the shelves, financial texts, philosophy, military strategy. The photographs on the desk, images of younger Taemin with men who must have been his mentors in the underworld. And then, while dusting the wall behind the desk, she noticed something. A subtle irregularity in the paneling. A seam that was almost invisible, but not quite. Not unless you were looking for it. Not unless you knew what to look for. A hidden safe. Victoria's heart had begun to race, but she forced herself to remain calm, forced herself to breathe deeply and steadily. She continued dusting, moving methodically through the room, and when the guard returned, she was exactly where she should be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, with no indication that anything unusual had occurred. That night, she spent 4 hours researching Taemin's schedule, cross-referencing his public appearances with reports from other staff members about his movements. She needed to find a window of time when his office would be empty, when she could access that safe without being interrupted. She found it. Every Thursday night, between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., Taemin had a standing meeting with his inner circle in the basement conference room. During those 2 hours, his office would be empty, and with the right excuse, Victoria could gain access to that floor without arousing suspicion. The following Thursday, Victoria waited until 11:15 p.m. Then she made her move. The hallways of the mansion were quiet at that hour. Most of the servants had retired to their quarters. The bodyguards were stationed at fixed positions, and the ones on patrol had established patterns that Victoria had memorized through careful observation over weeks. She moved through the shadows with the grace of someone who had trained for exactly this scenario, who had practiced moving silently through dark spaces, who had learned to control her breathing and heartbeat. The lock on Taemin's office was sophisticated, a high-end digital system combined with mechanical components, but her father had taught her safecracking before she turned 14. Every woman should know how to get into places she's not supposed to be, he'd said with a wink. Just in case. She had taken his words seriously. The office door took 30 seconds. The hidden safe took 45 minutes. Victoria worked methodically, using the techniques her father had taught her, reading the subtle feedback from the lock, understanding the mechanism as if it were a language she had always known how to speak. Sweat dripped down her temples. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept working, kept listening, kept feeling her way through the complexity of the lock. And then, finally, the safe clicked open. Inside were documents. Hundreds of them. Financial records stretching back years. Transaction logs for major operations. Lists of politicians and government officials on various syndicates' payrolls, organized by region and position. Military connections. Intelligence agency relationships. Everything. But more importantly, there was a letter. Handwritten. Addressed to Kang Taemin. Dated the day before her father's death. Victoria's hands shook as she picked it up and read her father's familiar handwriting, each letter as recognizable to her as her own face in a mirror. Taemin, I know what you're planning. I've always known. You were never subtle enough to hide from me. But I want you to understand something. The empire you're about to steal isn't built on violence or cruelty. It's built on networks. On relationships that take decades to create and seconds to destroy. If you kill me, you can take control of my operations. But without me, the entire structure will collapse within a year. The other families will sense weakness. The politicians will abandon you. The money will dry up. I could fight you. I probably could even win. But I'm tired, Tameen. I'm tired of this life. I'm tired of always looking over my shoulder. I want to retire. I want to raise my daughter somewhere quiet and safe. So here's my final offer. Work with me. Be my successor. Learn my methods. Build something greater than either of us could alone. If you refuse, I want you to know this. I have a daughter. Her name is Victoria. And if anything happens to me, I've left her everything. The true financial control of the entire empire. The real power. Find her, Tameen. Make peace with her. Because whatever happens to me, she will ensure that you never truly own what you're about to steal. If you're wise, you'll treat her with respect. If you're foolish, you'll make an enemy who controls your entire fortune. Choose carefully. Edward. Victoria read the letter 3 times, her vision blurring with tears she couldn't afford to shed right now. Not when she was in the middle of Tameen's office with guards just floors away. Her father had known. He had known exactly what was happening, had understood the danger, and had set up a contingency plan to protect her even after his death. She photographed every document with a hidden camera, a device so small it could fit in her palm, using techniques she had learned from intelligence operatives. She was methodical and careful, ensuring that every page was properly documented, that every word was captured. Then she returned them to the safe and carefully locked it back up, restoring everything to its original position. By the time Kong Tameen returned to his office, Victoria was back in the servants' quarters, curled up in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, her mind racing, her heart still pounding from the adrenaline of what she had done. She had what she needed now. She had proof. She had documentation. She had legal evidence that the empire belonged to her. She had leverage beyond measure. All she needed was the right moment to use it. All she needed was the perfect opportunity to reveal the truth in a way that would make it impossible for Tameen to silence her, make it impossible for him to deny the reality of her claim. #the gathering storm. Time runs out. As the weeks passed, Victoria became increasingly aware that Kong Tameen was suspicious of her. Started small. A glance that lingered slightly too long as she served drinks. An appearance in a hallway where he rarely went, an encounter that seemed too coincidental to be random. A question about her background that seemed more probing than the casual small talk one would expect from an employer to a servant. Tameen was not a stupid man. He had survived in a world of violence and betrayal by being alert, by noticing small details, by developing an instinct for danger honed through years of life in the underworld. And something about Victoria had triggered that instinct, had activated something in his subconscious that sensed a threat. She wasn't sure what it was. Perhaps a slight intensity in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. Perhaps a moment where her carefully constructed accent had slipped for a fraction of a second. Perhaps simply her presence in a place where he happened to see her multiple times, and some subconscious part of his brain had registered a threat through statistical improbability. Whatever it was, Victoria knew she was running out of time. She needed to move soon. She needed to take her shot before he decided to investigate her more thoroughly. Before he ran her fingerprints or dug into her background or contacted the employment agency that had placed her. Before the reality of who she was became apparent and he ordered her assassination. But she also knew that timing was everything. A premature move would be worse than no move at all. She needed the perfect moment. A moment when she couldn't be silenced or made to disappear. A moment when her revelation would have the maximum possible impact, when it would be witnessed by hundreds of people who couldn't all be eliminated simultaneously. That moment came 4 weeks before the planned banquet. Kong Tameen announced it himself, mentioning it casually to Ms. Park during a conversation that Victoria overheard while cleaning the hallway outside his office, staying perfectly still, her ears straining to capture every word. A grand banquet, a celebration of his complete and absolute control over the empire, an opportunity to gather all the major players in the Asian underworld under one roof and demonstrate his dominion. It will be the largest gathering of Power Soul has ever seen, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the partially open door. Every syndicate leader from Tokyo to Bangkok. Every politician worth corrupting. every businessman with ties to our operations. I want them to see that I've consolidated absolute control, that there's no question about the hierarchy, that this empire is mine, completely and irrevocably. Victoria's heart had begun to race with a combination of anticipation and fear. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. This was when she would make her move. This was when she would stop being invisible and step into the light of absolute power. The revelation. March 14th arrived with clear skies and a sense of destiny hanging in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. The luxury cars began arriving at the Kong estate at 7 p.m., pulling up to the main entrance in a carefully choreographed sequence. Rolls-Royces with custom armor plating. Bentleys piloted by drivers who had been trained in evasive driving techniques. Mercedes limousines with tinted windows that revealed nothing of the occupants within. Bodyguards in matching suits, speaking into hidden earpieces, checking credentials, establishing perimeters of security. The entire Seoul skyline seemed to light up as the most powerful and dangerous people in Asia converged on the mansion. Victoria watched from the servants' quarters as the guests were processed through security and directed to the ballroom. She recognized many of them from the documents her father had left, from photographs and intelligence reports she had studied. The Yakuza boss from Tokyo, a man with scars on his face that told stories of violence. The triad leader from Hong Kong, a woman who had clawed her way to power in a male-dominated organization. The Russian syndicate representative who had made his fortune on human suffering and organized violence. The Mexican cartel liaison who controlled drug shipments across the Pacific Ocean. Politicians with blood on their hands and corruption running through their veins like toxic blood. Billionaire businessmen whose empires were built on the suffering of others. All of them had prospered under the empire her father had built. All of them had benefited from his financial genius. All of them were about to learn the truth about who really owned what. The ballroom had been transformed into something almost otherworldly. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like captured stars, each one worth more than a car. Gold trim decorated every wall, creating an impression of opulence and power. The marble floor gleamed like dark ice, buffed to a perfect shine. Around the perimeter, tables were laden with champagne from the finest vineyards in France and expensive delicacies, imported from around the world. Victoria had been assigned to help serve drinks during the reception. It was a minor detail, but it gave her access to the ballroom and allowed her to position herself exactly where she needed to be when the moment came. She had worn the same black maid's uniform she wore every day, but beneath it, hidden beneath her collar on a thin silver chain, was a small pendant. Inside the pendant was a copy of her father's letter and the financial documents proving her ownership of the empire, preserved under glass. She had also left copies with a trusted journalist waiting outside the mansion with explicit instructions to release them publicly if something went wrong, if she was killed or removed from the ballroom. Insurance. Contingency planning. The lessons of her father applied even now, even in this final moment. As the evening progressed, Victoria moved through the crowd serving champagne and observing everything with the precision of a trained intelligence analyst. She noted the body language of the various crime leaders. She identified their allies and their rivals through the subtle cues of eye contact and physical proximity. She understood the political dynamics that were in play, the alliances that would shift once power changed hands. And at 9 p.m., Kang Taemin took the stage. He looked impressive, Victoria had to admit. The man knew how to project power. His tailored black suit fit perfectly, probably custom-made by a designer who catered to the extremely wealthy and questionable. His blood-red tie was impeccable, chosen carefully to suggest both wealth and a willingness to shed blood. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the ballroom without apparent effort, amplified by the sophisticated sound system but also by the natural authority he radiated. For 3 years, he began, his voice resonating with confidence. I have worked to consolidate control over this empire. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the assembled crowd. When I took over, there were those who doubted me, those who thought I lacked the strength to rule, those who believed I was merely a temporary custodian, keeping the empire warm until someone more worthy could claim it. He smiled, and it was a terrible smile, the smile of a man who had eliminated threats and enjoyed doing so. But I have proven them wrong. Every quarter, our profits increase. Every month, our influence expands. Every week, more territories come under our control. Applause rippled through the ballroom, dutiful applause from people who understood that it was in their best interest to acknowledge his power. Tonight, Tamim continued, his voice dropping into a more serious register, his expression becoming grave, marks a new chapter for this empire. He raised his glass high, and the assembled crowd followed suit, raising their own glasses in anticipation. To power, to dominance, to an empire that will never fall. It was the moment Victoria had been waiting for, the moment when every eye in the room was focused on him, the moment when the entire assembled power structure was centered on his presence, the moment when she could move without being noticed, when her movement would seem like part of the natural flow of the event. She set down her champagne tray with deliberate care and began to walk toward the stage. No one stopped her. Why would they? She was just a servant, just another piece of the mansion's machinery, just a functionary whose role was to serve the people who mattered. Several of the attendees didn't even register her presence, their eyes fixed on Tamim's form on the stage. She climbed the 3 steps to the stage, her heart pounding so hard she was certain that everyone in the room must be able to hear it. Tamim saw her at the last possible moment. His eyes widened slightly in confusion and alarm, his expression shifting as he tried to process what a servant was doing on the stage during his moment of triumph. "What?" he began, his hand starting to move toward his jacket. But Victoria didn't let him finish. With 3 years of rage and pain and loss behind the blow, with every moment of these 3 months of invisible preparation fueling her arm, with the strength of a daughter avenging her father's murder, she drew back and slapped him across the face as hard as she possibly could. The sound echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot, like the shot that had killed her father in Hong Kong, like the beginning of a revolution. The impact was so forceful that Tamim's champagne glass fell from his hand and shattered against the marble floor far below the stage, the pieces scattering across the surface like diamonds. The entire room froze. The music stopped. The conversations died. Every person in the ballroom stood absolutely still, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Disbelief hung in the air like a tangible thing. For 30 seconds, though it felt like an eternity, nothing happened. The assembled crime lords couldn't seem to process what they had just witnessed. Kong Tamim, one of the most feared men in Asia, had just been struck by a maid. It was incomprehensible. It was impossible. It violated everything they understood about the hierarchy of power. Then Tamim's hand moved toward his jacket, toward the gun Victoria knew he kept there. A Glock 19 that she had seen him touch absent-mindedly during his walks through the mansion, and the bodyguards began to move with lethal efficiency. But Tamim raised his other hand sharply, and they froze as if their nervous systems had been suddenly disconnected from their brains. He looked at Victoria, and for a moment, she saw recognition dawn in his eyes. Not immediate recognition of who she was, but an understanding that this was not a random act, that this was planned, that this was the moment when everything he had built was about to be challenged. "Explain," he said quietly, his voice dropping into a register that somehow carried more authority than shouting. Victoria stepped forward and spoke the words that would change everything. "You built your throne on stolen blood," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom, each word measured and deliberate. She reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew the envelope containing her father's documents and letter. She placed it directly in front of Tamim on the stage where everyone could see it. "Open it," she commanded. Tamim didn't move, but one of his lawyers, a nervous man who recognized the seal and handwriting immediately, picked up the envelope with trembling hands. His face went pale as he read, the color draining completely, leaving him looking like a ghost. "It's real," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The signatures are authentic. The documents are dated and sealed and—" He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple moving visibly. "They're real. The financial claims are all legitimate, all properly filed, all legally binding. The room erupted in whispers, the accumulated sound of dozens of powerful people realizing that the foundation of their understanding had just shifted. Victoria stepped forward and spoke the name that would define the story that would be told and retold in criminal circles for decades to come. My name is not Amelia Chin. She paused, letting the anticipation build. My name is Victoria Ashford, Edward Ashford's daughter. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Gasps, shouts, exclamations in multiple languages echoing through the ballroom. Edward Ashford's daughter. The girl who was supposed to be dead. The girl who everyone had believed died 3 years ago in the same incident that claimed her father. She was alive. She had been here all along. Invisible. Waiting. Preparing. And now she was claiming her inheritance. Victoria continued, her voice rising to project throughout the entire ballroom, ensuring that every person present could hear every word. My father, Edward Ashford, was the financial architect of this empire. He built it from nothing. He maintained it through genius and innovation. He sustained it through relationships and trust that took 3 decades to develop. She gestured around the room at the assembled faces of the crime lords and politicians. You all knew this. Every single one of you. He was the reason this empire functioned. He was the reason that money moved. He was the reason that political figures stayed bought. He was the reason that international operations proceeded smoothly. She turned to face Tameen directly. When my father was murdered, her voice cracked slightly. The only moment of genuine emotion she allowed to show, a calculated display designed to humanize her, to remind these people that she was a daughter mourning her father. He had already prepared for this contingency. She pointed to the documents. Those prove that legal and financial control of the entire empire still belongs to my family. To me, according to international law, according to the protocols my father established, according to the encrypted financial systems he created, I am the legitimate owner of this empire. She looked directly at Kang Tameen. You didn't steal the empire, Tameen. The words hung in the air like a blade suspended above his head. You didn't conquer it. You were running it for me. The ballroom went absolutely silent. The kind of silence that exists before an earthquake, before a storm, before everything changes irrevocably. Every person in that room understood the implication immediately. Kang Tameen, the man they had acknowledged as king for 3 years, was not actually in control. All his power was held at someone else's pleasure. All his authority was derived from a legal fiction. He was a manager, not an owner. A servant, not a master. And the true master had just revealed herself. Tameen's face cycled through emotions. Rage, denial, desperation. But he was intelligent enough to understand his situation completely. The documents were real. The woman before him was the daughter of Edward Ashford. The legal claim was airtight. If he killed her now in front of hundreds of witnesses from organizations around the world, if security footage captured the act, if journalists documented the event, he would be starting a war he couldn't win. The other syndicates would turn on him immediately. The politicians would abandon him. The entire structure he'd spent 3 years building would collapse. The money would dry up. The alliances would fracture. He had only one move. Only one way to survive this moment without starting a catastrophic war that would consume the entire Asian underworld. Very slowly, with a movement that seemed to take an eternity, Kang Tameen lowered himself onto one knee. The sound of his descent was like a gunshot, like the shot that had killed her father, like the beginning of a new era. Camera flashes went off throughout the ballroom, journalists' cameras capturing the image that would define the story. The most powerful man in Asia on his knees, in front of a woman who had been a maid 3 hours earlier, in front of a woman who had been invisible. I swear allegiance to the true owner of this empire, Tameen said formally, his voice steady despite the rage that must have been burning inside him, despite the humiliation of this moment. I pledge my service to Victoria Ashford. And with those words, the invisible servant became the visible queen. The maid who owned the empire had finally claimed what was hers. Don't forget to subscribe.